Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. We're in a series right now focused on cultivating a healthy church culture. So every church has a culture, whether they realize it or not. Some churches' cultures are reasonably healthy, and others may not be. And while no church is perfect, part of the work every church needs to engage in is to intentionally work to close whatever gap exists between being healthy and where they currently are. So in this series, that's what we're doing. We are seeking to close the gap. And this involves not only talking about the marks of an unhealthy church culture, but casting vision for how we, as the church, can embody a way of life together that, while it may not be perfect, is oriented towards goodness and kindness and love. And today we want to talk about a powerful toxin in the soil of unhealthy church cultures, and it's this, the idol of church growth. So let's get into it.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is Josiah.
And I'm Mac.
And I'm Katie.
And we're glad you're here to join us. But before we get in too far into our episode today, I have to go on a bit of a rant.
Oh boy.
So my daughter is 12 years old, and she is in her mind way cooler than me. And I am lame because I'm old, even though I really don't think I'm that old. But she listens to Taylor Swift. She is what they would call a Swiftie, and
It's not Swifter.
No,
come on, man.
I'm kidding.
No, she's a Swiftie, and we had this conversation a little while ago where she was trying to tell me, like, Dad, you don't understand. Taylor Swift is so cool. And I said, no, Zoe, you don't understand. Taylor Swift was ours before she was yours. She was our artist. So don't tell me how cool Taylor Swift is. And I've always been a Taylor Swift fan, especially of her music. But here's the problem. Well, I shouldn't say it's a problem. It's more of an observation. I think it's remarkable how much she has appealed to a different generation. Mm-hmm. So she went from one generation to another and is now like their artist. And it made me think of how just fads and trends just come in and out and they just cycle back around. But here's the question for us. What's one fad or trend that you would hope comes back?
Okay, well, first, in Zoe's defense, I remember saying something similar to my dad about Steven Tyler.
I feel like we're being triangled to like figure out who's right, Zoe or Josiah, you know?
Oh, I see.
Uh-huh.
I'm just saying I remember doing something similar. I think it was like an Aerosmith song that came on. And my dad must have like been singing it or something. And I remember turning to him. I was probably middle school or high school. Going, Dad, how do you know Aerosmith? And he still talks about that.
That's funny.
Zubas.
Ah.
I loved Zubas as a kid. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
You don't know
Okay, speaking
Zubas?
of my dad had multiple pairs of Zubas and he wore them every day.
Yes,
every single day.
Best.
They were like, they had team colors, right? They would have, like, he had Packer ones and they were that pattern.
They were sort of like really loud pants that were tapered.
Oh.
And I had them in elementary school and loved them. I would love for those to come back.
Yes.
Kind of like zebra stripes or...
I think they actually might be already.
Yeah, but not, they tried to have a resurgence, but it didn't gain popular support. And so it didn't quite resurface as a fad. And you said, right? Wasn't that your question? Like,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, you hope it comes back.
I want it to be widespread, like Taylor Swift's fandom, like that wide of support.
That's so funny.
It'd be great.
Well, maybe if Taylor Swift wore them.
Yes.
That's how you
there
could
you
get
go.
it.
The next era.
Yeah.
Next era.
The
is
next
Zuba
era. The Zuba era. But I just quickly Googled 80s and 90s trends, and I'm looking at these going, man, I guess I actually do a lot of these. Mom jeans. Yep, wear those. Sometimes I wear them on purpose to provoke all of you who make fun of mom jeans.
Well, just Mac does.
Well, not just Mac. There are other. Sarah in the office also makes fun of my mom jeans. Scrunchies. I mean, you guys have seen my scrunchies.
Yeah.
You have some oversized, like...
The bigger, the better.
Yeah.
The bigger, the better. Yep, flannels, do those. Platform shoes, probably have a couple of those. Flannels. Overalls. You know what I really liked from the 80s and 90s? Just remember when women had those big bangs that curled way out and they were separated? I had those as a kid.
You had to have a curling iron
that
was like gigantic.
And they had to be chunky. Like they had to be separated. Yeah. And then they would go like the bigger, again, the bigger the better.
Yeah. Zubas with bangs.
That's so
Zubas and bangs. Yep.
I know what trend that has sort of come back that I hope goes away. Maybe that's a better answer for me is Crocs.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Crocs are socially acceptable to wear out in public, just number one, I've never liked them.
Dude, both my boys.
But like all the kids, like they wear them to school in the winter.
Oh yeah, both my boys are on their second pair of white Crocs.
Yep.
And this morning there was slushy snow on the ground.
And they're wearing Crocs.
They're wearing their Crocs to the bus stop. It's ridiculous.
You guys, I couldn't disagree more. I love Crocs.
You like?
I love Crocs. Billy wore them to school.
Oh my gosh, I thought you were wearing some right now.
I would be. I wear socks and Crocs because it's convenient. I don't care if they're popular or not.
But it's not convenient. It's winter. We live.
Well, okay. Minus the snow
outside.
factor. Minus the snow factor. You can slip them on and run out the door. And I do let my children wear them to school. Millie wears her boots to school, but then she puts Crocs on when she gets to school.
Well, okay. Speaking of bangs, Zubas, and Crocs, imagine all of that together. And that's a perfect segue for where we're headed today. We're in a series right now where we're focusing on cultivating a healthy church culture. And this is part of a series. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to the previous episodes, you can go back and take a listen. But big picture, we're talking about church culture and just noting every church has a culture, whether they realize it or not. Some churches have a healthy or healthy-ish church culture, but many do not. In fact, there seems to be signs of widespread dysfunction across American church culture on a systemic level. Lance Ford puts it this way: the system of leadership that's been imported into the church from corporate America is what's producing our abysmal results. This system has been wholesale embraced by Christians, but there's nothing biblical about it. It's what Jesus called the way of the Gentiles. Unless we start to dismantle this godless system and replace it with a godly one, the church will continue to be plagued by scandals and spiritual abuse. So, borrowing from Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer's book Pivot, we've been using this metaphor of a fruit tree to help us out, talking about three sort of subculture systems: branches that bear fruit, the trunk that supports and feeds the branches, and then the roots that suck up nutrients from the soil. And we've been naming that the soil is the most important thing. Like if soil isn't healthy, if soil is full of toxins, the tree won't be healthy and won't be able to produce good fruit. And so we've been, in a way, setting up, here are the positive things that we need, the nutrients we need to put in the soil. We're kind of spending some time talking about, here's some toxins we're noticing in the soil of the American and evangelical church. And today we want to name a second toxin that is leading to unhealthy church cultures. To set this up, I want to do a little bit more history here that I think might be helpful. I gave a brief historical overview of the church growth movement in our last episode. And just a quick recap, I talked about how the church growth movement really began. It got its start in the 1960s under the influence of two missiologists, Donald McGavran and Peter Wagner. This led into or laid the foundation for the attractional or seeker-friendly model of church ministry that became super popular in the 80s and 90s. And the goal was simply to attract as many people to your church building as possible, get as many people coming to your church. And how do you do that? Well, it's about having the best religious goods and services that consumers might want to enjoy. The best kids ministry, student ministries, worship experience. And then we talked about how an essential ingredient, in fact, the essential ingredient, is sort of a lead pastor with lots of charisma that performs well in front of crowds. And we talked last episode about how this actually changes the job description of pastors. They go from shepherding people to performing for people. And then the qualification actually changes. We're now beginning to focus less on character and more on competency. Okay, so that's a quick summary of the last episode. In addition to all of that, I want us today to think about a massive assumption driving the church growth model of ministry. And it's this idea that church growth equals success. So the driving force behind the church growth model is the assumption that a successful church is a growing church. And this might be surprising to some who are listening, but I want to actually name that as a toxin. So the second toxin we want to discuss today is equating success with church growth. And I'll acknowledge this might be really hard for people to see at first. It's almost like wearing glasses. When you wear glasses, you have a specific prescription through which you're seeing the world. And it's like you're not even aware that you have glasses on because you've been so accustomed to wearing it. These are the lenses I'm seeing reality through. And so when you're looking through glasses, you're not often aware of the assumptions you bring to the table, maybe the paradigms that you have. And it's not until we actually take off our glasses and actually begin to examine the prescriptions that are informing our perspective that we may be able to see things in a new way. And I imagine it's somewhat like that. People have equated, if a church is growing, it must be successful or healthy. That has become so normative that to like really get underneath it, we actually have to take off those glasses and begin to examine them in a new light. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see that. And I think those certainly are, it certainly is a common perspective. Like a lot of people are wearing the glasses, including me at times. And you see that by how people talk about the church. Like, this church seems to be doing really well. And people kind of make their own assessment as they walk into Crosspoint. Like, seems like there's a lot of people here today. Like, that's so exciting. And it is exciting, right? Like, church growth is not a bad thing. Like, let's just say that. We're not saying, I think, that church growth is in itself harmful or that we shouldn't think about it or shouldn't talk about it. But we do want to talk about, I think, what you said, Mac, having it as the primary marker of success leads to some problems. And we want to unpack what some of those problems are.
Yeah, I think it's fair to have some caveats. I mean, if you're hearing us go, church growth equals bad, that's not what we're like. Unhear that. That's not what we're saying. We're
don't read the beginning of the book of Acts.
Yeah,
if you think that's true.
Right. This is going to be a nuanced conversation. So if you're going to continue listening, you're going to have to be able to tolerate some nuance here. We're not saying that church growth is necessarily bad. You're going to hear, we're not saying all quantitative measurements are bad. That's not what we're saying. But we are saying that there are some significant problems with equating success with church growth. And I think let's just start unpacking some of those. What would you guys say are some of the problems with equating success with church growth?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that if we look at the life of Jesus, if we go to the source, Jesus clearly doesn't define success as numerical growth. If that were true, he finished his ministry with just a handful of followers.
Yes.
So I think that right there we can sort of we can sort of nix that. I think we can also look at a few passages where Jesus was clearly presenting some concepts for us in the kingdom as opposed to the worldly kingdom. Is he references through a few parables calling people good and faithful servants. Rather than big and successful, look at everything you did. No, you were faithful and you served. We see Jesus washing feet and laying down his life for people rather than trying to promote himself. In John chapter 15, we have the concept of the vine and the branches, and it's important to note just how when Jesus is setting this concept up of us bearing fruit in the vine, in the branches, he references the Father as the vine dresser, and Jesus is the vine. We are to do nothing except for abide and remain in Jesus. And I think there's something really important to that, because bearing fruit becomes less about strategy and trying to squeeze out more. It actually requires surrender of our own accolades in order to do so. So we don't control the fruit growing process. If we're going to be fruitful, which is one of those terms that can be thrown around in church growth, being fruitful is not something we can control so much. And when we try to, we actually see that we shift away from what Jesus had. Another passage that comes to mind is Jesus saying that, like, he's saying, "Woe to you when all men speak well of you." So that would be a reference of big success, big everybody loves me.
There might be some compromises along the way if everybody loves you.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So, I mean, those are just a few passages. I know you guys can interact with that too, but some that come to mind.
Yeah, it seems that if Jesus had cared primarily about growth and being big and flashy and successful, he would have done things quite differently.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like when you look at how he spent most of his time with 12 people, when you look at how he prioritized faithfulness, even if it meant small and, hidden. Mm-hmm. And again, just not what we would look at and say successful. Jesus doesn't fit that paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you guys have both named this. Jesus starts small. He gives his primary attention. In fact, he lives most of his life in obscurity. Most of Jesus' life we know very little about. It's a little bit in the birth narratives, an incident when he's 12, and then we know the final 3 years of his life where he engaged in public ministry. Most of it he lived in relative obscurity. When he does engage in public ministry, he gives his primary focus and attention to 12 disciples. Among those 12, he seemed to give special attention to 3. So 3, 12, then you've got about 70, and we know that after his death, you've got about 120. That is not a lot of people. And yet those 120 receive the Holy Spirit and turn the world upside down, right?
Yeah.
And so he starts small, and eventually it does begin to grow, right? But I think you would be hard-pressed to read the Gospels and conclude that for Jesus, success equals growth. In fact, I'd even go further and say it's actually the exact opposite. He seems to actively resist it and even expose that assumption. So let me give you some examples. In Luke 14, it says that there's a huge crowd beginning to follow Jesus. And then he turns to them and says, unless you hate your father and mother, you can't have anything to do with me. Unless you pick up your cross and follow me, you can't be my disciple. And it's very offensive to the crowd. It's this high-hitting, hard-hitting teaching, and many of them walk away. And the disciples are like, what are you doing, man? We were kind of on a roll there. We were starting to gain momentum, right? Same thing in John 6. He feeds the crowds. The crowds are wanting him to feed them again. There's this momentum. And then Jesus says, hey, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you can't have any part with me, right? And all of a sudden, people are angry, upset. They start walking away, and he turns to his disciples, are you going to leave too? It seems as though Jesus saves his most difficult teachings for when the crowds are the largest. And the purpose seems to actually weed out the crowd rather than grow it. And none of that makes much sense if Jesus' primary goal is just numerical growth. He's intentionally doing things that create the opposite effect because his goal isn't crowd growth, it's disciples. In the book Pivot, they say numerical growth is a misleading indicator of a flourishing church. There are inherent tensions between selling out to attract crowds and devotion to making disciples, right? One author once said, hey, if you try to grow a church, you might end up with disciples. But if you make disciples, you'll get a church.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and clearly that's evidenced in the life of Jesus, spending more time investing into disciples and less about building a crowd of people who followed, right? And I feel like the proof is in the fact that if you don't agree with this, if you look at the life of Jesus, you could just look at all the times he could have focused on the numerical growth.
Yes,
all the things he could have done. I mean, he had the if he wanted, there was all these different groups of people that he could have appealed to in order to gain this sort of success. There's people wanting to make him a king, essentially, and their sort of political leader to go fight against the oppression. He had all these things that he could have done, and he didn't do those.
Yes, and here's where there's some nuance required, okay? Dan White Jr. says, while addition looks impressive, a commitment to multiplying disciples is far better in the long run. Jesus wants the kingdom of God to grow.
Yes.
He wants to multiply disciples, okay? But the way he does that is he starts small and focuses on people being formed into the likeness of Christ and then multiplying others. And actually, that's much more effective in the long run than just numerical addition. Does this make sense? So
Yeah.
it's like growth isn't the primary metric Jesus is using to determine success, but Jesus does care about growth, and he actually has a better strategy for pursuing that that doesn't just lead to numerical addition amongst crowds of people.
Well, here's the question that comes up for me, okay? What's growing? What is it that's growing? If Jesus were to change his message or his style or any of that, he would have gotten more numerical growth. But rather than numbers, I think he was focused on discipleship and transformation. That's what was growing.
Yep.
And he was focused on that with just a few people, because I think it's difficult, if not impossible, to disciple intensely a large group of people all at once. So he discipled a few, with the emphasis on them growing into discipleship. And then their growth in discipleship ends up rippling out to others.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. There's a difference between growing a crowd and growing disciples. And in fact, in Matthew's gospel, he's constantly drawing attention to that there's a difference between how the crowds respond and the way the disciples respond, right?
Yeah, he would take the disciples away and explain things that he said. Right.
Yes.
The disciples would ask, "Hey, what did you mean when you said that?" And he would expound more to them.
I think that's a perfect segue into a second problem. So again, just to summarize, the first problem, Josiah, you shared, is that it doesn't match Jesus's definition of success. The second problem I would name is just because something is growing doesn't mean it's healthy. A few weeks ago, I had like this kind of painful spot on my neck. And I went to Josie and I was like, "What is this? It hurts a little bit. Is it like a zit or something?" And she looks at it and she's like, "No, that is a skin tag." How gross is that, you guys? So we actually had to order this little kit, and it came with like these tweezers, and you kind of like pull the skin tag away, and then you freeze where it like attaches to your skin, and then it falls off. It's gone, by the way, which is wonderful. You know you're getting old when you wake up with like a random skin tag. Okay. The point is, just because something is growing doesn't mean it's healthy. Right? And there's tons of examples, right? Cancer grows ridiculously fast. It can grow aggressively. Bad habits can take over your life. They can grow and sort of balloon and sabotage the direction you're going. When you get older, your midsection grows. That's not necessarily a good thing, right? So there's all kinds of things. We know this. There's all kinds of things that can grow. And just because it's growing doesn't mean that it's healthy. And I think there's something similar there's a similar sort of lens we need to put on. Just because a church is growing actually doesn't mean that growth is healthy, right? Mm-hmm. What would you guys say about that?
Yeah, I think it ties into what we were talking about earlier. The word that you mentioned, Mac, was compromises earlier, and that sticks out to me. Like if your primary metric is growth, what compromises might be made to pursue that goal at all costs. Mm-hmm. And so if you're in a community that prioritizes, I don't know, take anything, a cool worship service. Okay, well, I think we have a cool worship service. I'm not saying that's bad. But if that's the main priority and you want to grow, well, then you're going to compromise other things to be able to have a cool worship service to grow. And again, just because you're growing and you have a cool worship service doesn't say anything about the soil.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Maybe a practical example. We had an elder on our leadership team, and this was shortly after we went through a pretty messy and disruptive time as a church. And this elder basically said, "Hey, I saw red flags and had concerns over the years of my time on this leadership team. But I just looked at how things were growing, and I looked at all the people that were coming and just thought, hey, what we're doing is working. We're growing. We're like, in other words, seeing all the people coming minimized, in his mind, it minimized and caused him not to state his concerns, right? And you'll find this isn't just here. This is everywhere. What ends up happening is when churches get really big, oftentimes when a mega church pastor fails or something, you'll find a group of leaders who failed to hold the pastor accountable. They noticed problems along the way, but they chose not to say anything because they saw all the numerical growth around them.
Yeah, so what you're saying is just because it's growing doesn't mean it's healthy. And on top of that, growth can be used as an excuse to cover up unhealth.
Yes.
And we are hearing that. I mean, listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. Look at a number of the church scandals. That excuse, yeah, well, there were these red flags, but it was getting so big.
Yeah.
Right.
So it can be that bad.
That's right. If you equate success with church growth and you notice problems, you're likely to minimize those problems, hide those problems, cover up those problems, or simply assume, hey, those problems don't even exist because look at how God is quote unquote blessing this. Right?
Yeah. Another one I would add is prioritizing church growth as the primary measure of success can produce consumers rather than disciples. Okay, so I have an analogy here. It's not perfect, but just bear with me for a second, okay?
Think of analogies.
Think of the difference between looking for like a home that you're going to move into and joining a gym. Okay? If you're looking for a home, you get your agent, you go on all these different showings, and you have this checklist of things that you're looking for. I want open concept. I want granite countertops, nice doors. I mean, whatever. Finished basement.
As bougie as possible.
As bougie as possible. You have your needs and your wants, this neighborhood, this school district, whatever. If you're joining a gym, let's say you like make a New Year's resolution, you show up. Typically, you're doing so, especially if you haven't been in a gym in a while, you're doing so with a little bit of humility, and you're looking to grow. Like you might get a personal trainer to help coach you or teach you. You might look for friends at the gym to have a community and keep you accountable. So the difference here is one, you're coming kind of as a critic with your checklist of items that you want. And in the other one, you're looking to grow and to participate, and you don't assume you know everything when you start. And I think that analogy can just be used in two different types of postures we can bring to a church. Okay? If we come with our checklist as if we're looking for a place to live and we want, these things, but not these things, it's a consumer mentality. Not saying you shouldn't be discerning about what church you enter into. You absolutely should be discerning, but that's a difference than having this consumer mindset as opposed to a discipleship mindset. How can I participate and how can I grow as a disciple here?
Yeah. There's a reason why mega churches are successful in this realm. There's a reason why there's a lot of people who go to the big church. And I think this hits it. It requires a lot less buy-in to show up at the trendy church that I can sit in with 1,000 other people around me and watch something that's perfectly produced, that is tailored exactly so I can feel comfortable the entire time, that requires no buy-in from me at all, and I can walk in and walk out and feel good about myself that I went to church. And so I think that it's just worth noting that there's a reason why this model works, which we did kind of talk about last week or last time. And if we wanted to, we could create that. But we're just, we're noticing the problem is that it can work that way. And with the gym analogy, it's harder work and requires much more investment and humility to walk into a church and say, I want to contribute. I want to follow Jesus with these people. I want to build relationships. I'm in it for the long haul, and that growth takes time. It's not instant.
Yeah, the punch of your analogy is if you show up to church like it's a house viewing, you're probably not going to grow very much. It's just kind of like this checklist. You're seeing if it meets all your wants and desires or whatever. But if you show up to church like a place, like a gym, like this is a place I plan to do spiritual training, that's going to change how you orient to that community quite a bit. And I would say, let's just be clear, but the mega church model and attracting huge crowds, it's not working. I'll just say it. It's not working. And this shouldn't be a surprise. That there's nothing controversial about what I'm about to name. In 2007, Willow Creek, they came out with a qualitative study, a multi-year qualitative study about attractional churches and what the results are. It was called Reveal. Okay. And what they revealed, the big reveal of Reveal was just what I said. It is not working. What they discovered, and kudos to them for publishing it, because this is like the penultimate church who's been training literally almost as many people as possible to multiply and reduplicate their attractional model of ministry. And then they have the courage to do a qualitative study over years and then produce the results to say, I'm sorry, it's actually not working. It's producing consumers rather than disciples.
Yeah.
And I think what's frustrating to me is that there were a lot of people who were naming this before all of that data was present to support it. I mean, you had people like Dallas Willard, who had been naming this since the 80s. Eugene Peterson was vocal about this for a long time. But what I'm saying is we have no excuse now. All the data shows that attracting crowds doesn't produce disciples, it produces consumers. Sally Morgenthaler says, we are not producing worshipers in this country. Rather, we are producing a generation of spectators, religious onlookers, lacking in many cases any memory to a true encounter with God, deprived of both the tangible sense of God's presence and the supernatural relationship their inmost spirits crave. Ouch. Alan Hirsch says, most people who attend church are passive. In other words, they are consumptive. They attend as passive recipients of the religious goods and services being delivered largely by professionals in a slick presentation and service. And here's the thing. We've been trying to maybe change at least the culture at Crosspoint for quite some time to create a disciple-making culture. But I'll just name, this is still in the water. This is still in the water we're swimming in. It's still in the air that we're breathing in. It still is very much alive and well. And I'll just say, because I still have conversations with people that might be leaving our church after some amount of time. And usually this is underneath the reason that they're leaving. Oh, Mac, your youth program needs to be a little bit stronger. And this other church right now, their program's stronger, so we're going to take our kids over there. You need to be preaching every week. We don't really like the shared preaching model. Your worship music is too loud. Your worship music isn't loud enough. We like hymns. You don't have a group for single people who are 53 on Tuesday nights. You know what I mean? And what you'll notice about these conversations is it's never we. It's never us. It's always you and me. Like, you aren't providing this for me, and so I'm going to go somewhere else to get it. And rather than, hey, our youth program isn't as strong as we'd like it to be.
And what could I do to lean in?
Right. So I'm just saying, yes, we've been working really hard to create a disciple-making culture at our church, and yet the consumerism is part of the broader culture and is still having impact here. And occasionally when people do leave, I still find that this is like deep underneath their reason for departing.
Yep, I'm finding that too. Yeah. Having been on staff for 2 years, I'm definitely seeing that. And again, it's not to say that you can't have opinions or things that, hey, I don't understand why we're doing this. But I think the point I would make is, if you see something that's missing or a community that doesn't exist, the first question ought to be, well, what could I do? Like, what could I do to step into that? Maybe it's something you can do. Maybe it's something you can't. But it's that shift between you're not doing this well enough and we as a church have an area of growth or a gap. And I wonder what I could do to attend to that.
Yeah, and this goes the other way too. Okay, like there's a couple that started coming to our church kind of in December, early January, and they said, hey, we listened online and we absolutely love the preaching here. And we've been going to this other church for like a decade or so, but we really love the preaching here. We think we might make the jump. And I said to them, I don't need, and we don't need another person to sit in the pews and enjoy our preaching. We don't need that. We need people who are ready to be disciples and make disciples as part of our work together. So don't just come here if it's because you enjoy what's happening on the stage. There's something deeper you're going to be challenged to, participate in. And if you're interested in that, here's our DNA class, and we'd encourage you to attend to it. And ultimately, you need to discern, how is God leading you? You know what I mean? This is about, where is God at work in your life, in your relationship together, and so on. And they came to our DNA class. I continued to calibrate a lot of pressure not to make a pivot just out of consumer-based needs or desires. And they did end up becoming members in our community, but their reasoning changed as a result. Like, as a result of kind of pushing against that, they really spent weeks in prayer discerning, how is God actually leading us here?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and then someone walks into the church saying, like, how can I be a part of it? Rather than, sitting back and wanting to consume it. I think one more thing to add to this is, I think this equating success with numerical growth ends up fostering competition among churches rather than collaboration. So it's no secret there's churches everywhere in a town, especially in a town like this. I don't know how many there are.
Lots.
Yeah, there are a lot. And when you're worried about numerical growth, getting people becomes like a zero-sum game.
Yes, that's exactly the phrase that came to my mind. It's a zero-sum game.
If this person walks into our building, that means they didn't get them. And now we're treating people as like commodities rather than people, and
to
sheep.
be discipled.
Yes, and sheep, as Jesus gave the analogy. Instead of focusing on serving your own people and your community, you're one-upping the church down the road with strategy. You're offended if someone leaves, and thrilled when someone wants to come here rather than being skeptical, right? So you're constantly trying to think of strategies in order to do that. Our eyes get directed out into the works that are happening in other places instead of trying to be faithful to care for the sheep in your own pasture.
Yeah, man. The universal church ends up competing against itself rather than partnering together to make a difference in the kingdom of God. Kent Carlson says, when we try to attract people by intimating that our church offers something better than the other church, we are complicit in a whole sorry mess of consumer Christianity. We are stuck in the wearisome game of keeping these people satisfied so they don't go to another church. We end up competing to get people to come to us, and when someone else goes over there, we feel it as a loss.
Yeah.
And then again, the impact, honestly, from a missional standpoint, like how are we actually engaging our community and being part of God's work outside the walls of the church, ends up being incredibly limited because we're not wanting to reach across our community and join hands with another church because we're competing against that church rather than co-laborers in the kingdom of God. And that to me is really sad.
Yeah. I think I want to share an example of, I know we're kind of talking about the negative examples of this, but my dad's a pastor. So growing up, it was a very small church growing up. It's grown recently, but I just remember my dad always had this mentality that if someone was leaving one church to come to his, there was always a bit of skepticism and challenge. Over the years, the pastors in town, it's a town smaller than this, but the pastors in town developed like an association of, I don't know what they call it, like a ministerial association where they would meet usually once every couple of months. All the pastors, just about all of them were a part of it. Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist. His church was like a non-denominational. They all met together and they talked about how they could serve their community. They talked about needs that their community had. And because of their relationship, there are actually some friendships built. And I remember being a part of one conversation where someone was leaving another church to say, "Oh, well, we don't like it there. We want you. We're coming over here." Like they're sort of like bragging, like, "You got us." And he's like, "Oh, well, I know that pastor, and I want to let you know that like we actually believe the exact same thing about that. So if you think you're getting something different, you're not. But if you're and his encouragement was like, I think you should probably go back and work it out with your pastor rather than trying to gain another member." So I don't know. Kudos to my dad for kind of being for sort of embodying this, and even when it was a small church that could have used members. It could have used people.
Yeah. And in fairness, some of that I think is happening here locally. Yeah. I know some of the other pastors, like-minded pastors in our area, and get together with them occasionally. And we've had some of those same conversations. Just this past week, I was talking to another pastor in the area who, this couple, it was kind of a proximity move. They lived further away from our community than his community, and they wanted to be more like rooted. A great reason. And his wife ended up passing away from cancer. So he said, hey, he let me know and kind of talked about how he was doing. That's the kind of like kingdom collaboration that I love. It's like, there's no hard feelings about, we're not treating people as commodities. It's like, hey, this person has been in our community for some time. They're now part of your community. Here's how you can pick up with their discipleship, investment, caring for them. Yeah. And then there's like this access to continue to hear how they're doing, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I hear us saying when we prioritize faithfulness to Jesus and making disciples over church growth, the whole landscape changes. We can see other churches really like as partners, more in the same mission, rather than competitors who threaten our success. So that's a good word.
Yeah. All right. So we've named some of the problems. So what does it look like if we want to shift away from this model and into something that's more holistically healthy?
Well, the first thing is we need to change our definition of success. And I think we've been hinting at this. If, growth is not success, then the question is, well, what is it? What alternative would you put on the table? And I'll put my cards on the table by proposing a new definition. I would say success equals faithfulness to Jesus, period. And you can be faithful to Jesus and your church can grow. That's awesome. I hope you've heard us name this again and again. We're not against church growth. You can be faithful to Jesus and the church can grow. And that's wonderful. But hopefully you've also seen and heard us say, you can also not be faithful to Jesus and your church can grow. And that causes all kinds of hurt and pain. And you've heard us talk about that on this podcast many times. In the end, I would submit the only thing that really matters is faithfulness to Jesus. And faithfulness might not always mean bigger buildings and budgets. Faithfulness might not always mean a larger crowd or a fuller sanctuary. Faithfulness might not always mean more popularity or social standing. In fact, if we take our cues from Jesus, it might mean the exact opposite. Faithfulness to Jesus might mean saying hard things that people don't really want to hear. Faithfulness to Jesus might mean disappointing people's consumeristic expectations. Faithfulness to Jesus might mean going to the cross. And let me just say two further things, and then I'll open up for you guys to press. I think this clarifies responsibility quite a bit. Josiah, you hinted at this earlier by talking about how we're really not responsible for fruit. And I want to double click on that and say, yes, from a kingdom perspective, from a biblical point of view, I'm actually not in charge of things growing. I'm not in charge of the fruit. I mean, that's God's job. Read 1 Corinthians 3. Paul goes, I planted, Apollos watered, but God made it grow. God is the one who made it grow. It's God's job to make things grow, not mine. And in fact, when we take credit for growing things, we're actually taking credit for what God has done. So my job is to be faithful and to trust God for the fruit. It's our job to be faithful and trust that God is going to produce the fruit, period. And that's not something we can control. When we try to control how fruitful we are, which is not possible, it leads to surface level growth and passive consumptive disciples. That's a quote from Dan White Jr.
You are not the chief growth officer.
Right.
Of Crosspoint. That's a title.
That's good.
You guys know that?
Oh, I did not know that.
No, it's a real job.
Okay, the second thing I want to say. So number one is it clarifies our responsibility. Our job is to be faithful. We're not responsible for growth. The second thing I want to say is that if our goal was just to get more people here at Crosspoint, I think I'll just say this, we would be doing things very differently. You guys already know this. This isn't new to you because we talk about this stuff all the time. But for our listeners, if we thought that success equated with church growth, if the bottom line was just to get more people coming, I'll be honest, we would do tons of things differently. Number one, I wouldn't be sharing the pulpit near as much as I am. Not because I think I'm the best speaker or the greatest speaker, but because evidence suggests that one person in the pulpit creates stability for people and is in the long run going to help more people come. Okay? I would do a lot more virtue signaling from the stage, to be honest. Instead of anchoring what I say in Jesus' life and teachings and risk offending people, I would do virtue signaling, predominantly to the political right, because we have a lot of our demographic, our surrounding community, Lake Country tends to kind of err in that direction. And my guess is our church would grow if I did that more frequently. Some of the stuff I've said to our congregation to guide them into greater faithfulness has been really hard over this past few years. And I honestly probably wouldn't say some of the stuff that I've said because it's hard to say. It risks offending people, takes a toll on me, and so on. I would also have our staff do a lot more programs and events that cater to consumers. And of course, you guys would get burned out in the process, but I could spin it to say, hey, the means justify the ends we're pursuing here. So we would provide a lot more opportunities for consumers to be satisfied. Does that make sense? So I'm saying, look, the definition is faithfulness. This clarifies responsibility. We're not responsible for the fruit. That's actually God's job. And in fact, if our goal was just to get more people, I can think of many things we would do differently to pursue that goal.
I hear you saying like Jesus is the standard. Like we hold up the life and teachings of Jesus and we go, how did he do this? And we did the same thing with our emotional intelligence series. With every episode, whether we were talking about anxiety or we're functioning, it was a matter of holding up Jesus and going, okay, well, how did he approach this? And no matter what the topic is, you guys, take your pick. Anything we talk about in this podcast or anywhere else, when you hold up Jesus as the standard, there's always going to be gaps. Always. I've never once stepped back in my own life and gone, okay, how do I measure what I'm doing or how I'm inhabiting this relationship or this conversation? How does that compare against Jesus? Yep, nailed it. Like I've never once said that.
Arrived.
Check. I guess I can go to work at a church now. No, so I just think, our definition of success and anything we do as believers should match Jesus. And if it doesn't, then we've missed the mark.
And we're going to be continually growing. I mean, this is embedded in the Reformation. We often lose sight of it. But the Reformation, there was this mantra, like always reforming. And so a church that has the goal of faithfulness to Jesus should always be growing, always attending to transformation, always be reforming in the process. We have never arrived. And that includes us, right?
Absolutely.
What else?
Another thing I would say is, we need to change the metrics we're using to measure success. So if it's not church growth, what is it, right? We don't want to sit back and go like, well, okay, we don't care about that, so we'll just hang out and be lazy. I don't know. There are lots of quantitative metrics that we could use. Okay, if we were going to adopt like the corporate strategic growth plan, there are lots of quantitative metrics that we could be using.
In the church, it's 3 B's. Budget, building, butts in the seat.
I was just going to say, I hope it's butts.
We're laughing, but that's what I've heard. It's like, hey, here are the 3 B's, the quantitative measurements that tell you you're a growing church. Bigger budget, bigger building, more butts in the seat.
Bigger butts.
Not bigger butts. Not bigger butts, more butts.
That's really funny. And I see that. Look, part of my role is to be responsible for our church's finances. So of course, there's a part of me that's like, if we have more people, it generally means more dollars. And I believe in what we're doing. And so we could have a bigger impact on the community. And like we could do lots of things if we get those 3 B's, right? There are all sorts of ways to measure quantitatively what we're doing. But what if we just flipped it and said, okay, not that we don't measure those things at all. We can certainly measure them and we can be aware of what our attendance is and how our financial health is. Yes. But what if our primary measurement is something different? If our primary measurement is, as you said, Mac, faithfulness to Jesus, lives being transformed, people growing as disciples, that's going to look different.
Yeah, can I jump in and just say one thing? Because I think we're in a nuanced conversation. I hear us trying to be careful to say quantitative measurements aren't all bad. But I do want to point out that they're incredibly limited in what they tell us. All right? In the book Pivot, Scott and Laura say this: although counting attendance numbers and giving are important, they cannot tell the whole story, nor do they reveal anything about transformed lives or Christ-like character. So it's just like we need to acknowledge that you can have all 3 of those can be growing and moving upward to the right. But that tells us actually very little about transformation. In fact, it doesn't tell us anything about how a community is being transformed or becoming more like Jesus. And so I think they do a good job. They say we need metrics based not just on how many people are coming, but on who they're becoming.
I'm guessing a contributor is that is much harder and takes much more work to actually quantitatively measure.
Absolutely. I just had a conversation with someone about metrics, and they said, what are our metrics? It should be church growth. It should be this. I said, well, it's discipleship to Jesus.
And that tells us nothing about discipleship to Jesus.
Right. And the response was, well, but Katie, how do you measure that?
Okay. Oh my goodness. Yeah. All right. Can I give some ideas?
Please do.
All right. And we cover a lot of the stuff in our DNA class. But we talk about communion, community, and commission. This idea that we're engaging up in relationship with God in community where people are being formed into Christ, and outside the walls of the church, joining what God is doing. Healthy churches will do all three. So there's a whole set of questions we could ask that could turn into metrics to say, how are people growing in relationship with Jesus? How are they being developed into Christ-likeness in the context of community and joining God's work outside the walls of the church? Cruciformity would be a metric that I might use. And rooted in the teachings of Jesus. Like, are people actually giving their lives away in Calvary-like love? Or are they predominantly self-centered and focused on their needs being met, right? Again, I alluded to the teachings of Jesus. Are we seeing people out of their transformation actually embody the teachings of Jesus? And let's just go to the Sermon on the Mount. That's the largest body of Jesus, the collection of Jesus's teachings. He said a lot more than what's in the. But are people learning how to engage in mature conflict resolution? That would be a metric. Are people practicing forgiveness, receiving forgiveness for when they mess up, extending forgiveness when they're hurt by other people? That would be a metric. Are they learning to love their enemies? The supreme mark of Calvary-like love. Are we seeing enemy love flourishing in our community? Are people practicing generosity? Are they resisting greed, consumerism, and materialism? That would be a mark of discipleship. Are they sinning less? Are they managing their anger, their lust, the things that Jesus points out in the Sermon on the Mount? See, these aren't things you can measure by just observing crowds sitting in a pew or in a stadium seating, listening to a sermon, right? Is there an increase in spirit sensitivity? Are we seeing people learn how to hear the voice of God and respond faithfully, even when that faithful response will require courage, maybe risk, or some sort of cost to themselves, right? Participation. Are we seeing people participate in the work God is doing, not just in running programs in the church to make sure the image of the church is better and better, but are they taking risks to join God's work in the world in risky ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are we? One thing I would add is, are we becoming a reconciling presence in the world? I'm getting ready to preach in just over a week. And one of the focuses is going to be a verse that calls us ministers of reconciliation. And I've really enjoyed just unpacking that verse and what that means. And it makes me think, what does it look like to be ministers of reconciliation, ambassadors of God's kingdom and his values out in the world?
And again, quantitative measurements aren't bad, right? We have data on all of those B's, right? But they don't tell us if a community is moving towards being ministers of reconciliation. We need different metrics to get at. Are people being formed into ambassadors of reconciliation?
And it is more difficult to measure, but it's not impossible.
It takes a lot more work. It takes a lot more work too. Going back to the last episode too, when it's Sunday focused, when it's personality focused, that's easy. You get those metrics every single week, but this requires relationship. Requires being close to, in proximity with your people. To know how those things are actually playing out in their lives.
Yeah, for sure. And you can control that. And you can't control this stuff. And it just makes me think this goes back all the way to Old Testament stuff. Think about Abraham promised to have a nation of people, as many as the stars are in the sky, right? He had to just be faithful, and way at the end of his life, right? He has a son.
Yeah.
So, and then he's reprimanded for trying to make it happen on his own, right? With his other son. So it's sort of like baked into how God is like inviting us as humans to surrender, to let him do the work, in Hebrews, it talks about all those people who, like, by faith, they were able to do this. Well, it's not the faith wasn't making them do all the awesome things. The faith was to surrender, to be faithful. And then most of them didn't get to see the fruit of everything until much later.
Yes.
And I think about stuff like this because you can't control it. All you can do is try to set up structures and make sure that I'm investing my time. If I'm on staff, I'm going to invest my time into relationships and some of these other things. We've had conversations about, like, hey, a big part of my job obviously is the coordinating the weekend service, but we're okay saying we're limiting how much effort you're giving into that because there's lots of other stuff that we care about, the stuff we just mentioned, that we want to be able to invest into. So all we can do is invest there, and we may live our whole lives pouring into this church and never get to see it like hugely flourish. And that's what it requires, is being able to lay down the control we have over manufacturing our own fruit and being able to say, oh, God, you know how to create fruit. You know how to bear fruit. We're just going to be faithful to these things that I know matter to you the most.
Yes. That's such an astute point. And yeah, I mean, most of the people who in Hebrews 11 who embodied faithfulness didn't get to see the fruit. There's a book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, and it talks about how in the early church, I mean, they were a persecuted minority, but practiced the way of Jesus together. And they didn't get to see the fruit in the same way. And it's a great book. It's a little bit heady, but it's a great critique of, I think, some of the cultural norms that the evangelical church or a larger American church has embraced that's actually compromised our faithfulness along the way. But again, if you're sitting there going, oh, well, what metrics matter? Yeah, we can talk quantitative measurement, sure. But I just listed a whole bunch of qualitative measurements that I think are actually more important. Is there a sense of communion, community, commission? Is the church growing in cruciformity? Are people practicing the teachings of Jesus? Are people living spirit-sensitive lives? Are they participating meaningfully in the work of God in the world? Are they a reconciling community? These are qualitative metrics, and as Adam pointed out, they actually take a whole lot more work to measure and to produce.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I would just add, our first series on this podcast was going through our church's values, and those line up with everything you said, Mac. And so if someone wanted to dive deeper into what each of those things looks like and how you measure it, I would encourage them to go back and listen to that series.
Yeah. Another thing that I would add is just to elevate the value of learning. So this changes the focus from success and performance and focuses more on learning, right? When everything's about success and performance, there's no room to fail. Because if I fail at my job, when it's about people and butts in the seats, right? If I fail that, if people aren't there, now I've failed. And so then it perpetuates this cycle of needing to perform and then fearing failure and then maybe even covering up failure when it happens rather than embracing it as an opportunity to grow. Part of the shift towards faithfulness is just normalizing failure and the ongoing dynamics of learning. So, like normalizing it. I think of our leadership intensives. There are year-long discipleship groups. We talk about this all the time. One of the first things we have to sort of deconstruct from our minds is the feeling of that guilt and shame when you do mess up, and that it sort of just becomes this crushing weight. And instead, we just sort of normalize it. We say, yeah, you're going to mess up a ton. But our point here is that we're going to learn. And the more we can take the pressure off, it actually allows us to press into the growth in a much more healthy way. But genuine growth and not just numerical. So, I think that what this does, and I think we alluded to it a little bit in the last point, was that it produces humility. Because now, if I do grow, it actually came from the growth came from me screwing something up or being like noticing something that we didn't do very well. And now it can be like, oh, well, I'm just going to further submit to Jesus in this one area and watch him produce fruit rather than in the way I tried to do it myself. We stop controlling outcomes and focus on our obedience and faithfulness and our response to Jesus. And at the end, we don't get to take credit for the growth when it happens. And I think that's sort of that humility is sort of something that ends up getting produced in the process when we elevate the value of learning rather than producing.
Yeah.
Man, I think there's a lot there. If it's all about drawing crowds and attracting people so that the community grows, well, there's no room for failure, right? The religious goods and services that are being provided to people have to maintain a certain standard, right?
Yeah.
We can't let any of that slip. Otherwise, people walk away or people won't want to come or whatever. There's no opportunity to risk, to try new things, right? Because we have a standard to maintain. And I'll just add to what you've said that we're also living in a day and age of discontinuous and rapid change. And so talking about generational differences, the younger generation, I think, is less and less intrigued or enticed by the super polished crowd, attractional model. Like they don't like that. And, I don't hear you saying this, but there's also like this pendulum swing where we kind of justify getting really sloppy or doing things really poorly. I'm not hearing you say that either.
No.
I'm just saying if the church is going to continue to be a faithful community, living in the way of Jesus and joining God's work in the world, learning needs to be a high value for us. And we need to acknowledge that some of the best learning takes place when we actually stumble.
Yeah.
Yeah. And normalizing that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And normally, I mean, to go back to it, normally what we notice even in these groups, what we notice is our failure is usually our attempt to make something happen on our own, or it all comes back to just a lack of surrender to our true identity in Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so our failure, it's less about, we tried something and people didn't come. I'm not necessarily even saying that. It's like our small, like focusing back on we tried something and realized God wasn't in it as much as we thought he was.
Mm-hmm.
So being willing to pivot somewhat quickly, like, hey, we're going to try this for a season, or being willing to let go of something that maybe was an old form that we don't sense the Holy Spirit moving in as much as he used to. I mean, things like that. Like as a church, you do have to have conversations, and a lot of times it can be it's difficult to shift away from those things because those were forms we could control. We knew how it worked. I know if I do X, Y, Z is going to happen. Shifting to a posture of learning allows us to pivot and to try to be a little more responsive to where the Spirit may be moving in our community here and now.
Yeah.
And it can be scary. It's scary to not control things and to have to admit that you've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I think that's happened here, just in things you try, and you try to like, hey, no, we're just going to try this for a while, and if it fails, right, people don't come, then people can get critical, be like, hey, what are you doing here? Yeah, I just think it's a tricky thing to balance with people.
Yes, normalize learning and failing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay, taking a step back, this whole series is about healthy church cultures, right? So culture has been a common theme through these episodes. And one of the ways we've talked about culture is by saying everyone is responsible for shaping the culture. Leaders have more responsibility. We talk about like tone at the top. They kind of set the tone. But culture is formed by everyone who leans in and participates. You can't just get up on the stage and announce like a change in culture and bam, like it's done. So with that in mind, what practices or recommendations might we give people who are listening, especially if they're part of this community, to say, here's how you can practically lean into this? If you want to be a part of prioritizing these other things, this cruciformity in the way of Jesus, over church growth, what can you do if you're not a leader, you're not on staff, you're not a board member? Like, what can you do as a member of the church?
Yeah. Maybe one practice I'd encourage if you're listening to this episode would be to create some space afterwards and spend some time evaluating your own discipleship to Jesus. One of our primary critiques throughout this episode has been that when you make church growth the primary marker of success, it creates consumers rather than disciples. And so maybe it's worth holding up your own life and doing an audit and going, man, am I really a disciple of Jesus? Am I growing closer to Jesus? Am I connected in community? Am I engaged in mission? Is my life marked by cruciform love for God and love for others? Am I practicing the teachings of Jesus? Am I engaging in mature relational conflict and conflict resolution? Am I extending and receiving forgiveness, loving enemies, being generous, resisting sin, all that stuff? Am I learning how to walk in step with the Spirit and follow God's leading in my life? Am I living a responsive life? Am I participating or am I just consuming? So I guess what I'm saying is like, yeah, the church is a sum total of everyone's efforts and participation. If we're saying faithfulness to Jesus is the mark of a successful church, it really comes down to each person kind of going, man, am I taking my own discipleship seriously? Am I being formed in the way of Jesus? What else?
Who am I becoming as a disciple? I guess I would add to that. And how am I helping disciple others? The whole goal is to transform ourselves and then to lead from that place of transformation. I can't get up and lead. Well, okay, I can. I could lead a group or a class or preach a sermon based on head knowledge and just kind of come at it with the idea of imparting information on people. But I think a practice is become a disciple and then lead out of that place. Like where you've surrendered your own transformation to Jesus, ask him to help you then disciple others in that same way.
Yeah, I think that's a good clarification. It's about experiencing your own transformation as a disciple of Jesus and then investing in the discipleship of those around you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you're sensing a staleness to your own discipleship, I would sort of encourage that. I think that's probably a pretty good sign that God may be leading you to take a step further into participation in your church community. Mm-hmm. If you're sensing that maybe life is stale, like my spiritual life is a little stale, or I've been coming here for a while and I'm just been watching, and there's probably it's probably not us that's making it stale, I guess is what I'm saying. In your own, evaluate your own discipleship apart from the things you're consuming at our church, or or your own church. If you're
I think it was that Reveal study. I could be wrong, so not on the record, but I think that they mentioned that like, hey, what we're noticing is people who are newer to faith rely on the church and the church's programs a lot more than those who have been following Jesus for a long time. And those that do experience sort of that qualitative growth eventually own their faith on their own and then invest in other people. So I'm just affirming what you're saying. If you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, my experience in church feels stale right now, I feel kind of stuck, it's perhaps because you've outgrown like the initial like excitement of listening to a sermon or being part of a small group. And what's going to take you to that next level of engagement is to prioritize your own discipleship to Jesus and perhaps even start investing in other people, right?
Yeah. And I'd say practice number 2 is sort of, we're already alluding to it, is just move beyond attendance. Move into, if you're attending on Sunday once every couple of weeks, maybe find a group of people. Like we have small groups, we have places you could serve within our church community, kingdom communities. There's a handful of those. There are a variety of ways in which you can say, I want to move beyond just being a consumer. Like that's one of the things we are, we don't always do perfect at, but try to create opportunities and avenues in which someone could move beyond consuming and into participating.
And our job as the church is to help create the structures to help you do that, right? We certainly can do that. And if you want to have a conversation about how can I plug in or how can I participate, like we have all sorts of thoughts and ideas and places you can step in and people who are willing to disciple others, and we want to support you in that journey. So big picture, focusing on growth as the primary indicator of success in a church really does not lead to a healthy church. nor is it what Jesus modeled for us. What we've said today is that a successful church is a faithful church, and faithfulness requires a whole different set of metrics.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Hang in there. We've got 2 more episodes where we're going to name some toxins in the soil, and then I think our focus is going to shift to really some positive nutrients we can put in the soil to grow and flourish and pursue Tov, all that is good.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.